Hi, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School, and this is part 2 of our look at the parts of an argument. Specifically, what are some of the ways that we can look at how arguments are created and structured? The first thing to consider is when you're building your argument is what type of evidence do you have? How are you going to support what it is that you're saying? The first definition we're going to talk about is a reason. That's a general statement that supports the claim that you're making. Then there's evidence, which can consist of facts, statistics, your own personal experiences, comparisons, and any examples that help to show why your claim is valid. And finally, there's emotional appeals. These are the things that are going to appeal towards pathos that will help your audience feel something that hopefully will make them more inclined to believe what it is that you are trying to convince them of. Now, when you're constructing formal arguments, there are two types to think about, inductive and deductive, and we're going to take a look at each one of these. The first is inductive, and this reaches a general conclusion from observed specifics. In other words, you go out, you look at a lot of data, and then you form a conclusion based on these individual pieces of information. So, for example, by observing the performance of a large number of athletes, you could conclude that athletes possess physical stamina. Now, deductive works kind of backwards from this. Deductive starts with your major premise and then moves towards more specificity based on these minor premises. So to take our argument about athletes from the last slide, we could say in a deductive way, athletes possess physical stamina. Then because Anthony is an athlete, he must possess physical stamina. So you see how that kind of reverses the way that you arrive at your conclusion. Now, as you look at an argument and you try to figure out how the author has structured it, you want to always think about your rhetorical triangle. So you always start with your kind of your ethos here. What can you figure out from the title? What's it suggesting? Who is the author and what are the qualifications that this author seems to possess? What's the date of this publication? Is this something that's very recent and current, or is this something that may be a little older and maybe isn't something that is as up to date with the information? So then you can start to break down. So as you look at the arguments that are being presented, you want to think about the definition of terms. They should be very carefully defined and used consistently. One word might be something like benefit. What would be a benefit? Is that just a small thing that makes something better? Would it have to be a really large impact? So look at how terms are used to support a claim. Then you can look at cause and effect relationships, and remember that evidence that the relationship exists should be present. And then there's implied or stated value systems. Are the arguments actually consistent with a specific value? So when you're faced with an opposing viewpoint, you want to always question the accuracy, the relevancy, and the sufficiency of the opponent's evidence. In other words, is there enough evidence and is there enough of the right type of evidence? Is the opposing viewpoint actually supported with logical and relevant evidence? Now, you want to pay really close attention to emotional appeals because they can be really effective. We pay a lot of attention when our emotions are effectively involved, but you want to be careful of unfair emotional appeals. So look for words that seem to be emotionally charged or for really biased language. Sometimes you'll see things like false authority, an athlete endorsing underwear as though wearing the specific brand is actually what causes them to earn their gold medal, or maybe a movie star is selling shampoo. And also look for association. If a car is named as a cougar, it's supposed to remind you of this sleek kind of animal, or maybe a cigarette advertisement that features a scenic waterfall to make you think that this is fresh and natural. So they are trying to form this association with this element based on this thing. But that's really kind of an unfair emotional appeal, and it's a way of using language in order to create this impression or this bias. Now, the next couple slides, we're going to go over a couple of errors in logical reasonings. These are often referred to as logical fallacies. They're things that seem to sound like they should be true, but if you actually break down the argument, it's quite flawed in some way. One of them is known as circular reasoning, or sometimes known as begging the question, where it seems to set up a statement, but the statement itself doesn't offer any proof. So, for example, female police officers should not be sent to crime scenes because apprehending criminals is a man's job. I mean, there's no evidence in that, it just kind of comes back to itself. or a hastily generalization. This is a conclusion that's derived when you don't have sufficient evidence. Because one apple is sour, all of them in the bowl must be sour, for example. A few more logical fallacies include things like a non sequitur, which is Latin literally for "it does not follow." And this is when you try to connect two things that don't really have a connection. Because my doctor is young, I'm sure she'll be a good doctor. Like, what does the youth have to do with being a good doctor? And then second is one of the most common ones that you'll hear in the news a lot, which is that correlation does not equal causation. So just because I opened the umbrella when I tripped on the sidewalk, it doesn't mean that the umbrella caused you to trip. So just because two things happen at the same time doesn't mean that there's a cause-effect relationship between them. Or the idea of an either-or fallacy, that because of one thing you have to apply it to the whole. Because of the violence, TV must be banned. So there's no way to handle violence on TV except to get rid of everything. So when you come across an argument, the first thing you want to do is identify the claim. What is it that the author is actually saying is true? What types of evidence are being used? Look at the adequacy and sufficiency of the evidence, and then note, does the author recognize or refute any counter arguments? So you can compare the different types of evidence are used, figure out which argument you found most convincing and why. What was it about that argument that actually convinced you? And again, watch out for emotional appeals. And then what further information might be useful in assessing the issue? In other words, what else would you still need to know in order to come to a good conclusion? And this is the end. This is the end of the companion piece to the two-part slides on argumentation. And be ready to consider some of these different issues when we look at some of the arguments we'll be analyzing in class. That's it.